Some people think ownership is whatever they can shout the loudest. They usually stop shouting the moment they read the right document. The smell of fresh pine still drifted through the open cabin windows as I carried my last cardboard box across the rough hardwood floor. Outside, the morning air was crisp enough to sting my lungs, and somewhere beyond the tall spruce trees a creek murmured over smooth stones exactly the way the realtor had promised. After 20 years of deadlines, board meetings, and airport terminals, silence finally sounded expensive enough to be worth every dollar I'd spent. My name is Ethan Walker, and 48 hours earlier, I had closed on what looked like nothing more than an old mountain cabin tucked away in northern Colorado. Weathered cedar siding, a wraparound porch that creaked beneath heavy boots, 3 acres of untouched woodland wrapped around the house like a protective blanket. Most people saw an aging cabin that needed repairs. I saw the first place that had ever truly felt like home. I had barely finished unloading the pickup when I heard tires crunching across the gravel driveway. Not one vehicle. 3. The sound echoed through the trees long before I saw them. Black SUVs rolled straight toward my porch as if they already owned the place. Doors opened almost in perfect sync. 5 people climbed out wearing matching polo shirts embroidered with the Willow Ridge Property Association logo. Their leader walked ahead without waiting for an invitation. Tall, perfectly pressed clothes, expensive hiking boots that had clearly never touched real mud, sunglasses perched on her head like a crown. Patricia Collins, 53 years old according to the neighborhood directory I'd glanced through the night before. HOA president. She carried a thick folder under one arm and wore the confident smile of someone who had never been told no for very long. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't ask whether she was interrupting. She simply climbed my porch steps, looked past me into my own living room, and said, "You'll need to stop moving in. This land belongs to the association." The words hung in the cool mountain air for a second, longer than they should have. I actually thought I'd misheard her. Behind Patricia, the others spread across my front yard holding clipboards, taking photographs of my truck, my tools, even the fresh stack of moving boxes still sitting beside the porch rail. One man hammered a bright orange survey flag into the ground near my mailbox, while another unfolded a laminated property map with the confidence of someone announcing a verdict instead of asking a question. Patricia handed me several printed notices already clipped together. Unauthorized occupancy, improper structure compliance review, immediate land use investigation. She spoke as though every page had already become law. You'll have 72 hours to vacate unless ownership can be established to our satisfaction. I looked from the paperwork to the freshly painted cabin sign I'd installed only an hour earlier. The cedars still smelled warm beneath the morning sun. A woodpecker tapped somewhere deeper in the forest while a cold breeze rustled the pines overhead. Everything around me felt peaceful except the people standing on my porch pretending my property belonged to them. Patricia folded her arms, clearly waiting for panic, excuses, maybe an apology. Instead, I smiled politely, thanked her for bringing the documents, and asked if she had a complete copy of the association's current lease records. Her smile hesitated for the first time. It was only a fraction of a second, but I noticed it. She assumed I was asking because I was confused. She had no idea I was asking because I already knew exactly where those records would lead. I accepted the stack of papers with both hands, not because I believed a single word on them, but because years in business had taught me something simple. The person who rushes to argue usually knows the least. The person who quietly reads everything often wins before anyone else realizes the game has started. Patricia mistook my silence for uncertainty. I could almost see it in the way her shoulders relaxed and a satisfied smile returned to her face. She glanced toward the volunteers behind her, as if the entire encounter had already become another success story for the monthly neighborhood newsletter. I thanked her again, stepped back inside, and gently closed the cabin door. The scent of fresh cedar wrapped around me as sunlight spilled across the wooden floor through the large front windows. For a moment, I ignored the paperwork completely and looked around the room instead. Every beam overhead had been hand-cut decades ago. The stone fireplace still carried faint traces of wood smoke from the previous owner. A battered rocking chair sat beside the window overlooking the valley below, exactly where I had imagined drinking coffee every morning without conference calls, investors, or quarterly reports interrupting the quiet. Most people assumed I bought the cabin because I wanted to disappear after selling my commercial real estate company. They were only half right. I did want peace, but I had not spent 20 years building property portfolios across 3 states by making emotional decisions. Every purchase had a reason, and this one was no exception. 6 months earlier, I had started researching mountain communities that had complicated ownership histories. Places W. By late afternoon, the mountain had settled into that peaceful rhythm that had convinced me to buy the place in the first place. Wind whispered through the towering pines. A hawk circled lazily above the valley. The scent of sun-warmed cedar drifted across the porch while I tightened the last screw on an old porch swing the previous owners had left behind. It almost made me forget the parade of clipboards that had arrived that morning. Almost. At exactly 4:15, another convoy of vehicles rolled up my gravel driveway. This time there were 4 instead of 3, and they parked with practiced precision as though they had rehearsed the entrance. Patricia stepped out first, carrying a thicker binder than before. Behind her came 2 board members wearing matching polo shirts, and another woman balancing a laptop beneath one arm. They walked across my property without hesitation, never slowing down to admire the cabin or the forest surrounding it. To them, every inch of land looked like another line on a compliance report. Patricia stopped a few feet from my porch and smiled with the same polished confidence she had worn that morning. It was the kind of smile that looked friendly from a distance, but disappeared the moment anyone questioned her authority. She announced that the board had completed an emergency review and determined my occupancy created multiple concerns for the association. According to her, my truck was parked outside the approved alignment area, my porch light did not match neighborhood architectural guidelines, and the freshly stained cabin sign required design approval despite being installed on my own property. She listed each alleged violation with remarkable confidence, while the woman beside her typed notes into the laptop without ever looking up. I listened quietly. Every sentence revealed less about my cabin and more about how Patricia operated. She did not ask questions because she believed questions implied uncertainty. She issued conclusions first and searched for justification afterward. That explained why so many people probably surrendered before challenging her. She was not louder than everyone else. She was simply more accustomed to people giving in. While Patricia spoke, a few nearby residents gathered along the road. Some folded their arms. Others pretended to walk their dogs a little more slowly than usual. Nobody interrupted. Nobody defended either side. They simply watched another chapter of what was probably a familiar routine. Patricia finally reached into her binder and removed another document. She informed me that if I refused to cooperate, the association would begin additional administrative action and seek legal remedies available under community regulations. Her tone suggested that this outcome was inevitable, almost generous, as though compliance would save me from unnecessary trouble. I thanked her for the information and asked a simple question. Had the board personally reviewed every document governing the land beneath the community before making these decisions? The board members exchanged quick glances. Patricia answered immediately. Of course they had. Everything had been reviewed years ago, and the association understood its rights completely. Her confidence never wavered, but one of the men standing behind her shifted uncomfortably and looked down at his shoes. Tiny reactions often reveal more than long speeches. Patricia handed me one final envelope before turning toward her vehicle. She reminded me that deadlines would not change simply because I disagreed with them. Then the group drove away, leaving fresh tire tracks across the gravel and a cloud of dust floating slowly between the pine trees. I looked down at the unopened envelope in my hands, smiled to myself, and carried it inside. Every confident statement Patricia had made rested on one assumption that had never actually been verified, and the closer she pushed this dispute toward official paperwork, the sooner that assumption would become impossible for anyone to ignore. I expected another letter. Instead, the campaign became personal. The following morning, I woke to the rich smell of coffee drifting through the cabin and the pale orange glow of sunrise stretching across the valley. For a few peaceful minutes, the only sounds were birds settling into the treetops and the distant rush of water below the ridge. Then a slow electronic chime echoed from my phone. Another email from the association. Then another. By the time I finished breakfast, 6 new notices had arrived. One questioned the placement of my outdoor firewood. Another claimed my pickup truck qualified as a commercial vehicle because it displayed a removable magnetic company logo from years ago. A third informed me that all exterior improvements required prior approval, including the porch swing I had restored the previous afternoon. Every message carried the same polished language, the same official formatting, and the same quiet assumption that I would eventually become exhausted enough to surrender. Around noon, I drove into the small town a few miles away to buy groceries and introduce myself to a local hardware store owner. The cashier smiled when she noticed my address on the loyalty form. "You bought the old Harper cabin," she said. "Beautiful place. I hope they leave you alone." She did not have to explain who they were. Apparently, everyone already knew. An older gentleman loading lumber into his truck overheard the conversation and walked over with a sympathetic smile. He told me Patricia had been president for nearly 8 years. Most people simply paid whatever fines appeared because challenging the board usually meant months of letters, inspections, and uncomfortable neighborhood meetings. Nobody wanted to spend retirement arguing over paperwork. As I thanked him, he lowered his voice just enough that only I could hear. "She always pushes hardest when someone new moves in." That sentence stayed with me all afternoon. When I returned to the cabin, another surprise was waiting. Bright orange notice tags had been attached to temporary stakes near the driveway entrance, identifying areas scheduled for future association review. No construction had begun. Nothing had been damaged. But the message was obvious. Patricia wanted every arrival and every departure to remind me that she believed she controlled the land beneath my feet. Later that evening, I walked the property line with a flashlight as cool mountain air rolled through the pines, carrying the earthy scent of damp soil after a brief summer shower. Every survey marker installed during closing remained exactly where the licensed surveyor had placed it. Every boundary matched the certified plat recorded with the county. Nothing about the physical property supported the confidence Patricia displayed. Only the paperwork did, or at least the paperwork she believed existed. Before going inside, I noticed fresh tire tracks stopping near the edge of the road overlooking my cabin. Someone had parked there recently, watched the house for a while, and quietly driven away. I smiled without realizing it. They thought observation created pressure. Years of negotiating multi-million-dollar property acquisitions had taught me the opposite. Observation creates information, and information always belongs to the person who understands it best. I carried the latest stack of notices inside, placed them neatly beside the earlier ones, and organized every page in chronological order. The pile was growing thicker by the day. Patricia probably believed she was building a stronger case with every new document. She did not realize she was carefully creating the timeline that would eventually explain exactly how her own assumptions unraveled. I never answered a single accusation with an argument. Instead, I answered every letter with a request for information. Certified mail went out the next morning asking for copies of the association's governing documents, current ground lease agreements, historical amendments, architectural enforcement policies, and the complete record of every board vote related to my property. I kept the wording polite, almost boring. Years earlier, one of my first mentors in commercial real estate had given me advice I never forgot. He said the strongest legal move often sounds like the most ordinary question. Patricia apparently did not share that philosophy. Within 2 days, another envelope arrived informing me that my requests were unnecessary because all relevant authority already rested with the board. That response interested me far more than if she had simply produced the documents. People who truly understand their own paperwork rarely hesitate to share it. I spent the next several mornings settling into mountain life while waiting. I repaired a loose porch railing, stacked firewood beside the cabin, and explored an old hiking trail that followed the creek through towering pine and aspen trees. The mountain smelled different after sunrise than it did at dusk. Morning carried cool earth and wet moss. Evening brought the warm scent of cedar and distant fireplaces drifting across the valley. Every quiet hour reminded me why this place was worth protecting. Yet every afternoon another notice appeared in my mailbox. Some were delivered by certified mail. Others were taped directly to my front door. One questioned the color temperature of my porch lights. Another claimed my mailbox required architectural review because I had polished the brass numbers. The details became almost predictable. What never changed was Patricia's certainty. She believed constant pressure would eventually produce compliance. One afternoon, I drove to the county recorder's office under the simple excuse of confirming that every document from my closing had been properly indexed. The clerk recognized my property immediately. She smiled politely and disappeared into the records room before returning with several oversized map books and decades of recorded filings. I spent nearly 3 hours reviewing surveys, easements, lease renewals, and property transfers. Every page fit together exactly the way I remembered from due diligence before the purchase. Nothing had changed. If anything, one small notation buried inside a lease amendment made the overall picture even clearer than before. I quietly requested certified copies of several recorded documents, thanked the clerk, and left without mentioning the ongoing dispute. There was no need. Facts do not become stronger because more people know them early. They become stronger when they appear at exactly the right time. That evening, I noticed another association vehicle parked near the entrance road. Patricia was speaking with 2 homeowners while occasionally pointing toward my cabin. They all looked in my direction as I drove past. I waved. They hesitated before waving back. Something about calm confidence unsettles people who expect confrontation. Back inside the cabin, I spread every document across the large dining table. On one side sat the growing stack of violation notices arranged by date and subject. On the other side rested certified county records organized just as carefully. Looking at both piles side by side felt strangely satisfying. One collection represented assumptions repeated often enough that people accepted them as truth. The other represented recorded history that had never changed regardless of who happened to be president of the association. Patricia believed she was forcing me into a corner by increasing the pressure each day. In reality, she was giving me something much more valuable. She was creating a complete written record proving exactly how confidently the board acted without fully understanding the foundation beneath its own authority. 3 days later, my phone rang just after 8 in the morning while I was sanding an old cedar bench beside the porch. The fresh scent of sawdust mixed with cool mountain air as I wiped my hands on a shop towel and answered. It was Melissa Grant, the real estate attorney who had handled several commercial acquisitions for me over the years. I had asked her to independently review one specific section of the county records without mentioning the situation unfolding at the cabin. She did not waste time with small talk. "Ethan," she said, "you were right to ask questions. I think the association has been operating on assumptions instead of reading the actual chain of ownership." I carried my coffee onto the porch and listened while the morning breeze rustled through the pines. Melissa explained that decades earlier the mountain community had been developed under a long-term ground lease rather than a complete land sale. Individual homeowners owned their houses and improvements, but significant portions of the underlying land, including common areas, roads, utility corridors, and several residential parcels, remained under a master ownership structure that had changed hands over the years. Most residents never noticed because the lease renewed automatically and annual payments were handled through the association. Then she reached the part that made everything finally fit together. 6 months before I purchased the cabin, the investment company that owned the master ground interest quietly decided to liquidate several assets. Rather than buying only the cabin itself, I had followed my normal due diligence process and acquired the holding company that controlled the remaining ground lease interests attached to the surrounding community. At the time, it had simply looked like the cleanest way to complete the transaction without creating title complications. Now that decision carried an entirely different meaning. Melissa continued explaining that every homeowner still owned exactly what they believed they owned. Nothing about their homes was in jeopardy. However, the association itself occupied and managed leased property under agreements now administered by the company I legally controlled. The board possessed authority granted by its governing documents, but those documents did not place the association above the recorded lease obligations. I remained quiet for several seconds while everything settled into place. The silence was interrupted only by wind brushing across the porch roof and the distant call of a blue jay somewhere down the hillside. Suddenly, Patricia's confidence made perfect sense. She had inherited years of procedures from previous boards and simply assumed those procedures represented absolute ownership. Nobody had apparently reviewed the underlying lease file in a very long time. Melissa emailed certified copies of every relevant document within minutes. I opened each attachment slowly, comparing them to the copies already spread across my dining table. Every signature matched. Every recording stamp aligned perfectly with the county records I had reviewed myself. There was no hidden technicality, no dramatic loophole, only a straightforward legal history that almost everyone had forgotten existed. I leaned back in my chair and looked out through the large cabin windows toward the entrance road where Patricia's board members had stood so confidently only days earlier. They had walked across the property believing they were speaking to an ordinary homeowner who needed permission to remain. They never imagined they were delivering compliance notices to the person whose company had inherited the very ground lease supporting the association's authority. For the first time since moving into the cabin, I allowed myself a quiet smile. I still had no intention of embarrassing anyone or creating unnecessary conflict. But from that moment forward, every conversation would take place with the complete history finally sitting on the table, exactly where it had belonged all along. The following Monday, an official notice for the monthly board meeting appeared in every homeowner's mailbox. Buried halfway down the agenda was a short line inviting discussion regarding unresolved compliance matters involving my property. Patricia probably expected another routine meeting where the board approved recommendations and homeowners nodded without asking many questions. I arrived 10 minutes early carrying nothing more than a slim leather portfolio. The meeting took place inside the community lodge overlooking the valley, a beautiful timber building filled with the comforting smell of pine floors and fresh coffee. Residents gathered around folding tables, quietly chatting about hiking trails, roof repairs, and the coming winter. Several people glanced toward me with curious expressions, clearly wondering whether the newest resident was finally coming to defend himself. Patricia entered precisely on time, wearing another perfectly pressed blazer, smiling as though everything had already been decided. She welcomed everyone, reviewed routine business, approved landscaping expenses, and eventually reached my name. Her voice remained calm and professional as she summarized the alleged violations collected over the previous week. She spoke with complete confidence, referring repeatedly to the association's authority over the property and its responsibility to protect community standards. When she finished, she looked directly at me. "Mr. Walker, would you like to respond before the board proceeds?" I stood, thanked the board for allowing me to speak, and placed a single folder on the table without opening it. "Actually," I said, "before discussing compliance, I would appreciate clarification regarding the association's current ground lease administration." The room became noticeably quieter. Patricia answered immediately that the matter was irrelevant because ownership questions had been resolved years earlier. I nodded politely and slid one certified county document across the table, then another, then a copy of the recorded assignment transferring administration of the master ground lease. Melissa had organized every page with color tabs so anyone could follow the timeline in minutes. Patricia frowned for the first time since the meeting began. She turned one page, then another, before handing them to the association's attorney seated near the end of the table. He adjusted his glasses, carefully read the recording information, and his expression changed in a way that required no explanation. He requested several additional documents, comparing signatures, recording dates, and legal descriptions in complete silence while every homeowner watched. The only sound inside the lodge came from the ceiling fan turning slowly above us. After several long moments, he cleared his throat and addressed the board instead of me. He explained that the documents appeared consistent with county records and indicated that the company administering the association's long-term ground lease had indeed changed ownership months earlier. He paused before adding the sentence nobody expected to hear. "Based on these filings, Mr. Walker is the managing owner of the entity serving as the association's current ground lessor." Nobody spoke. Patricia looked back toward me as though expecting me to deny it. I simply smiled and thanked the attorney for reviewing the documents so carefully. Then I calmly explained that I had never intended to interfere with homeowners or disrupt the community. Every resident still owned the homes they had purchased. My concern had always been much simpler. If the association expected everyone else to respect contracts, then it had to respect its own. The violation notices, the demands, and the repeated claims of absolute authority had all been issued without first verifying the very lease supporting the board's position. For the first time since moving into the cabin, Patricia had nothing prepared to say. The confidence that had filled every previous conversation quietly disappeared, replaced by the unmistakable realization that the person she had spent days ordering off the mountain was, in fact, the landlord of the land her association leased. The silence inside the lodge lasted only a few seconds before whispers spread from one table to the next. Homeowners who had arrived expecting another routine compliance hearing were suddenly flipping through copies of the county records the association attorney had requested. Several people leaned toward one another, quietly comparing dates and signatures, while Patricia remained frozen with both hands resting on the edge of the conference table. For the first time since I had met her, she looked less like someone issuing orders and more like someone realizing she had skipped the most important chapter of the manual. The association attorney finally broke the silence. He recommended that every enforcement action connected to my property be suspended immediately until the board completed a full legal review of its governing authority and lease obligations. No dramatic speech, no raised voices, just one calm recommendation from the only person in the room who had actually finished reading every document. Patricia attempted to recover by suggesting the matter had merely been an administrative misunderstanding, but one homeowner stood up before she could continue. He introduced himself as David Reynolds and explained that he had served on the architectural committee years earlier. He admitted he had always assumed the association owned the common property because that was what every incoming board had repeated. Another resident raised her hand and asked why the lease had never been discussed during annual meetings. A retired accountant requested copies of the financial reports connected to the lease payments. Within minutes, the conversation shifted away from my cabin entirely. The focus was no longer on one homeowner refusing to comply. It was on how an entire board had been making decisions without fully understanding the legal foundation supporting those decisions. I remained seated and answered only the questions directed toward me. I explained that I had no intention of changing existing leases, increasing fees, or disrupting anyone's home. Families had invested their savings here, and they deserved stability, not surprises. My only expectation was exactly the same one the association demanded from every resident. Respect the contracts that already exist. The attorney nodded in agreement and recommended forming an independent review committee composed of homeowners, outside legal counsel, and financial advisors before any further enforcement actions resumed. Patricia looked around the room searching for support, but the expressions she found were thoughtful rather than obedient. People were no longer relying on confidence alone. They were asking for documentation. That was the real turning point. Before the meeting ended, the board voted to withdraw every pending notice issued against my property while the review moved forward. The motion passed, without a single objection. As residents slowly gathered their belongings, several stopped beside my table to introduce themselves properly for the first time. One elderly couple apologized for assuming the rumors they had heard were accurate. Another homeowner thanked me for remaining respectful even after receiving so many notices. Walking back toward my cabin that evening, the cool mountain breeze carried the familiar scent of pine needles and damp earth through the valley. The same gravel road that had welcomed black sport utility vehicles only days earlier now felt strangely peaceful beneath my boots. I never wanted anyone to lose face or feel humiliated. Watching people discover the truth for themselves was far more satisfying than proving them wrong. Because real authority does not need dramatic entrances or loud declarations. Sometimes it simply waits, quietly documented in county records, until someone finally takes the time to read what has been there all along. 2 months later, the mountain finally felt the way I had imagined on the day I first unlocked the cabin door. The mornings began with sunlight spilling through the pine branches and painting long golden lines across my porch. The smell of fresh coffee mixed with cedar as the breeze drifted up from the valley, carrying nothing but birdsong and the gentle sound of the creek winding through the trees below. The stack of violation notices that had once covered half my dining table now rested inside a single storage box on a shelf in the study. I kept them there for one reason. They reminded me that paperwork can be used to intimidate people just as easily as it can protect them, depending on who is willing to read it carefully. The independent review committee completed its report a few weeks after the meeting. Their findings confirmed exactly what the county records had shown from the beginning. The association had misunderstood the scope of its authority for years, not because the documents were hidden, but because each new board relied on assumptions passed down from the previous one without verifying the original records. The board formally withdrew every compliance notice issued against my property and adopted new procedures requiring legal review before future enforcement actions involving ownership questions. Homeowners received clear explanations of the community lease structure for the first time in decades. Instead of creating conflict, the transparency produced something unexpected. Trust slowly replaced suspicion. Patricia resigned from the presidency before the next annual election. She never made a dramatic announcement or attempted to defend every decision that had been made. During our final conversation, she stopped beside my porch one quiet afternoon while the scent of wildflowers drifted across the hillside. She admitted she had genuinely believed she was protecting the neighborhood. I told her I believed that was probably true. Good intentions, however, are never a substitute for accurate records. She nodded thoughtfully before wishing me well and walking back toward her vehicle. It was a simple conversation, free of anger, and somehow that made it more meaningful than any argument could have been. The new board reached out soon afterward, asking whether I would attend occasional meetings as an advisor whenever questions involving land records or lease administration arose. I accepted under one condition. Every decision would begin with the documents themselves instead of assumptions or tradition. They agreed without hesitation. Sometimes I still laugh when I remember the first morning those black sport utility vehicles rolled into my driveway while I was unpacking moving boxes. Patricia had stepped onto my porch completely convinced she understood who belonged on that mountain. Neither of us knew that day would eventually improve the entire community instead of dividing it. The porch swing I restored during my first week remains my favorite place to end each evening. From there, I can watch the sun disappear behind the ridgeline, while cool mountain air carries the familiar scent of pine through the valley. Neighbors wave as they pass. Some stop to chat about fishing, hiking, or the weather. Nobody talks much about compliance notices anymore. They talk about living here. Looking back, I never won because I argued louder, threatened anyone, or embarrassed the people who challenged me. I simply trusted the facts, respected the law, and allowed the truth to arrive in its own time. Real power does not announce itself with a badge, a title, or a stack of warning letters. It waits quietly inside the record book until someone finally turns to the right page. Justice is rarely loud. It is patient, precise, and inevitable. Thank you for watching this story. If Ethan Walker's calm determination and respect for the truth inspired you, please take a moment to like this video, share it with friends who enjoy legal drama and stories where patience defeats arrogance. And do not forget to subscribe to the channel for more unforgettable HOA conflicts and real-world justice stories. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss our next story about property rights, hidden documents, and ordinary people who refuse to back down when the facts are on their side. Finally, leave a comment below and tell us this. If you were in Ethan's position, would you have forgiven the HOA board? Or would you have taken stronger legal action? We would love to hear your thoughts.